Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Rich Nielsen, Associate Professor of Political Science here at MIT and Faculty Director of the MIT MENA program. And I'll be moderating today's session, both here in person and online, where people will be joining us with their questions as well. Thanks for joining us for Geopolitics of the Strait of Hormuz. In a rapidly evolving region, gaining clarity beyond the headlines. This event is sponsored by the MIT MENA program and by the MIT Center for International Studies. I'm especially grateful to David Dolev, Michelle English, Sarah Zakaria, everyone else who makes these events possible at CIS. Really, thank you. This one especially, as you can tell, is quite timely. That means it's come together fast. So thank you for your work. We're also especially pleased to have members of the MIT community here on campus and also online. Thank you for joining us. If you were able to find this room, we expect that a few people may come in late, not having yet found the room. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the center of global energy flows and regional security dynamics, and I will say at the center of every headline of every major newspaper for at least the last week. Recent developments have once again underscored how quickly shifts in this region can reverberate worldwide economically, politically, and strategically. And of course, while we hope to give you perspectives on the geopolitics of the Strait of Hormuz, I have asked our panelists to take us wherever they need to help us understand the broader war, where the Strait fits into it, what's happening, what's at stake, and what may lie ahead for this conflict between the United States, Israel, Iran, countries in the Gulf, and people affected worldwide. I'll introduce our panelists. Caitlin Talmadge is the Raphael Dorman and Helen Starbuck Associate Professor of Political Science at MIT and a faculty affiliate with the MIT Security Studies program. Her research focuses on military strategy, great power conflict, and nuclear escalation, with deep expertise in Iran and Persian Gulf security, specifically thinking about closing the Strait of Hormuz. Nader Habibi is the Henry J. Leir Professor of Economics of the Middle East at Brandeis University's Crown Center. His research focuses on economic development, oil economies, and the political economy of the Middle East, with particular attention to how regional dynamics shape economic outcomes. Ali Kadivar is Associate Professor of Sociology and International Studies at Boston College and a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. His work examines social movements, political conflict, and state-society relations in the Middle East. And Dafna Rand is the Robert E. Wilhelm Fellow at MIT's Center for International Studies and previously served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Her work spans U.S. foreign policy, regional diplomacy, and governance across the Middle East with an eye to how U.S. policy might engage the region, not just in the past, but in the future. Thanks all for being here. I've asked our panelists to make opening remarks, and then we will turn it to you and to all of you online for what I hope will be a lively Q&A. I will say at the outset and repeat myself that since we have experts in the room, I would like questions instead of statements, if you'll go with me there. And if you give me too long of a statement, I will interrupt and turn it into a question to the best of my ability. We'll try to take as many questions online, but I may not be able to take them all. I'm sorry. We may have up to 250 participants or more online. And I retain the right to edit those questions for clarity. Please, Caitlin, if you could kick us off.
Sure. Thanks very much, Rich, for kicking us off as well, for the introduction, and thank you to the Center for International Studies for organizing this event, and to everyone who's joining us, both in person and online, after what has, I think, been, all of us can agree, a very sobering month of war. And I know we all come to this event and to this panel with different perspectives, which I'm looking forward to engaging with. I come at this as a longtime student of US military strategy and operations, including in the Strait of Hormuz, which I'll get to. But I want to make a kind of a broader point to kick off some of the discussion, which is that I think the overriding thing that I observe about the war so far is that it is the situation in which US military operations have actually been very poorly connected with the pursuit of US strategic and political objectives, as stated at the outset of the war. There has really been a mismatch there between the application of military force and the attainment of stated US objectives, and it's unclear to me whether that gap will actually be closed through the application of military force. This is a war that, in my view, was launched from a place of hubris after American military successes in applying very short, sharp, decisive force against Iran last summer in Midnight Hammer, against Iran's nuclear program, and in the raid against Venezuela to capture Nicolas Maduro. And I think the US entered this war in the belief that it could very rapidly apply overwhelming military force and collapse the Iranian regime, which would solve a bunch of other problems for the United States and Israel in the region. And make no mistake about it, the Iranian regime is a terrible, brutal regime that has killed lots of Americans and lots of people in the region and lots of Iranians. So no one should shed any tears over that goal, in my view. But with that said, the idea that air power alone was going to produce sweeping political change, I think, was misguided at best. Air power by itself has never in the history of air warfare led to a successful democratic regime transition, much less in a country like Iran. And as we're seeing, in fact, politically, the application of military force may actually have been a negative development in terms of the internal politics of Iran, killing off a couple rounds of top leaders and potentially elevating and entrenching even more hardline elements of the regime, as I have a feeling we'll talk about today. So in terms of the stated goal of regime change, the application of military force, although devastating and overwhelming, really has not produced that outcome. It also has not produced the rollback or elimination of Iran's nuclear program, which, if you listen to the president speak about the war, it is one of the major justifications, the idea that the United States cannot and will not live with a nuclear Iran. What's interesting when you actually look at the military campaign is that the military campaign that the United States and Israel have been running actually has done very little to focus on nuclear relevant targets in Iran. It has mostly been about leadership, assassination, and going after conventional military targets, which I'll talk about in a moment. But again, it's not clear that the military campaign is actually designed in a way that's well suited to solving that problem, or that military force can solve that problem. Now, the United States may choose to escalate in certain ways, for instance, sending in ground forces to go in and try to capture Iran's highly enriched uranium, or it may think that it can achieve coercive leverage through continuing to apply military force in a way that will produce some sort of diplomatic bargain over ending Iran's nuclear program. But to date, none of those things have been achieved. And I would just note that even if somehow this war does achieve the outcome of eliminating Iran's nuclear program or rolling it back or slowing it down, the costs and casualties involved in doing so really should be taken into account relative to not the alternative of doing nothing, but to the alternative of a diplomatic solution for working on that problem, which actually was something that the Iranians were negotiating at the time that the US and Israel launched this war, and something that I think was also being achieved by the Iran nuclear deal, which the Trump administration chose to unilaterally withdraw from in 2018, despite the fact that the United States, again, under the first Trump administration, had certified Iran as being in compliance with the agreement. So, I think it's a hard case to make that this war was the only way to solve the Iran nuclear issue, or even that it will solve the Iran nuclear issue. And we can talk more about that in Q&A if people want to. The other major goal, as I mentioned, that the United States has emphasized in pursuing this war and applying military force is the destruction of Iran's conventional military capability. And it's true, the United States has wreaked a lot of damage on Iran. It has engaged in a really significant degradation of Iran's ballistic missile force. And of course, that is somewhat related to the nuclear program, because if Iran were to develop a nuclear weapon, it could use its ballistic missile program to deliver a nuclear warhead. So they're not totally separable. But I would just note that the figure that CENTCOM loves to quote is that Iranian launches are down about 90% of missiles and drones since the first days of the war, which is true. But if you look a little bit closer at the numbers, it's looking like only about a third of the missiles have actually been destroyed. The Israeli numbers are something like 2/3 of the launchers are destroyed. And asterisk, Israel also said it destroyed 2/3 of Iran's launchers last summer. So, I mean, these things seem to kind of grow back like mushrooms after a rainstorm. So, it's not totally clear how much damage has actually been done despite the scale of the US and Israeli campaign. And the metric that I would recommend looking at is whether they're still launching, which they are. The Iranians are still launching about 10 to 15 projectiles just about every day, and they are hitting stuff. I mean, they're hitting towns in Israel. They are causing casualties. They've done significant damage to US radar installations in the region. They've conducted successful attacks against US aircraft that are, parked out in the open at a Saudi airbase, tanker aircraft, as well as US airborne command and control aircraft. So they are, experiencing some successes, and they are able to continue to inflict damage on the US and Israel, and also on other states in the region. And I would also just note that we don't think Iran has actually even employed its most advanced missiles yet in this war, missiles that are more maneuverable, missiles that might have a better chance of penetration after US and Israeli air defense has been degraded in the region. And so the threat is very much still there. And I guess the point I'm getting at, again, is there's been a big military campaign, but if the goal is rolling back the missile and drone threat, that simply hasn't happened. The other aspect of the conventional campaign that we hear CENTCOM talking about is the degradation of Iranian naval capability. And this does get into the Straits issues. And the statistic, again, that they like to have as a talking point is that 92% of Iran's large naval vessels are now at the bottom of the ocean, which, again, I have no problem with that. But the issue is that Iran has lots of other asymmetric naval capabilities, and those are actually the ones that are relevant to doing things like closing the Strait of Hormuz. And those sorts of assets are things like hundreds or even thousands of small boats, naval drones, known as unmanned surface vehicles, mines, and of course, anti-ship cruise missiles. And those still seem to be out and about causing problems. If you look at the data that CENTCOM releases about the campaign, it does not appear that CENTCOM really focused on Iran's mine warfare assets until the second week of the campaign. We didn't hear about going after Iran's anti-ship cruise missiles until the third week of the campaign. And so, it seems that there was some lack of focus on the specific capabilities that were actually relevant to threatening traffic in the Strait, and that Iran retains those capabilities despite the campaign. And that's why you don't see, a regular amount of traffic going through the Strait. And I think it's also why you don't even see US naval escorts of that commercial traffic, because I think the environment is still too threatening to risk sending US warships and fighter jets and Apache helicopters at the level that would be needed to really make a difference in terms of escort operations. And I'd be happy to talk about that more if people want to in Q&A. And so instead of military force really producing decisive political and strategic outcomes, what we're seeing as we enter now into the second month of the war is a search by the United States for other options. And so we are hearing reports of the buildup of ground forces in the region, which to me, again, is an implicit recognition of what I've been talking about, which is that application of air power alone has not achieved political or strategic objectives. And so, I think the entry of, 2 Marine Expeditionary Units and, elements of the 82nd Airborne into the region raises the question as to whether the United States is seeking to escalate further. And one thing we could talk about is whether we think escalation along those lines would actually produce Iranian capitulation. I have my doubts. If it did produce it, I think it would be at significant cost in terms of casualties to the United States. It's possible that the United States views the buildup of those ground forces in the region as a bargaining chip to try to pressure Iran into some sort of off-ramp in the war. It remains to be seen, again, whether that would be successful. I personally think that Iran, as a country that has faced 2 large-scale air campaigns within the last year from the Israelis and the Americans, is probably not interested in giving them an easy out at this point and has an interest in prolonging the military and economic pain that it can inflict, and as such may not take an off-ramp even if one is offered. So I will pause there, and I look forward to everyone else's comments and questions and engagement.
Great, thank you so much. Nader, over to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to focus on the economic dimension of the conflict because I think it's because of these economic factors that the course of the conflict has come to where it is today. Strait of Hormuz, situated in the Persian Gulf. When you look at the littoral state of the Persian Gulf, the largest concentration of oil and natural gas resources in the world are in that small region, something around perhaps 60% of the supply. And it produces a significant amount of oil and natural gas on a daily basis. And that is why the closure has caused such a significant adverse impact on the global economy. Total production of oil is about 106 million barrels per day. About 18 million barrels of that comes from Persian Gulf. About 7 million of that 18 goes through pipelines from Persian Gulf to the Red Sea or pipelines across United Arab Emirates to the Sea of Oman. But something around 11 million goes through the Strait of Hormuz. And that has been disrupted for the past 5 weeks. Not completely, but the amount that flows varies, but it's significantly very small. Now, if that continues for several months, it is going to cause global recession, or at least a strong recession in Europe, in some Asian countries. But the Strait of Hormuz is not just important for oil. There are other resources that are important. Qatar, the small country of Qatar, produces something around 17% of the total liquefied natural gas global supply. And after an attack by Iran, which damaged the facilities, Qataris shut down the production of natural gas. That has already affected several Asian countries, such as India, Taiwan, Bangladesh. The other products that are important and come from Persian Gulf are petrochemicals, a variety of petrochemicals, and fertilizers. We are heading towards a disruption in the market for fertilizers as we are approaching the planting season, and that's already affected the projections for the cost of agricultural products coming forward. Aluminum production has been disrupted. So global economy would be impacted by this if the closure of the Hormuz continues. But it's not just the closure that has affected the global economy. US and Israeli attacks on Iran's oil energy assets have provoked retaliation against the energy facilities and refineries, even production lines, wells of other countries. Implication of those attacks is that even if the Strait of Hormuz is opened after perhaps negotiations in the short run, the repair and restart of production takes several weeks. Right now you have a condition called shut-in many of the production lines. It takes a few weeks to restore that. The production facilities that have been damaged, it takes a while for them to be restored. So we are talking about an impact on the oil market which will last for several months, in my opinion, at the very least. I think we are going to see a spike up to $150 per barrel. In the previous cases of Middle East conflict or other crisis, once the crisis is over, it will come down sharply. This time, I think it's going to be a slow reduction. And that means recession and economic hardship, primarily in Europe and Asia, but some impact on the United States as well. So that was the global impact. What about the regional impact? The GCC countries themselves have been impacted, not by the loss of oil revenue and the prospects of limited oil revenues for several months or maybe 1 year or 2 years to come, but also the non-economic sectors of these economies. United Arab Emirates, Dubai in particular, relies on tourism. It also relies on aviation because 3 airlines in the region, Emirates Airline, Qatar Airline, and Etihad Airline, have become major hubs for transportation between Europe and Asia. Dubai, UAE airports alone serviced 90 million passengers in 2025. So that has been temporarily disrupted, and depending on how long the conflict lasts, it is going to impact their economies. Tourism, significant impact that is going to last for 1 or 2 years. And perhaps in the future, there would be some fear of risk that potential tourists will take into account. Foreign direct investment, very crucial. Many of these countries have developed diversification development plans. You might have heard of them, Vision 2030, Vision 2045, very ambitious programs to attract foreign investment. Some of them have been already successful. Dubai, the entire this glamorous city is built primarily on attraction of foreign investment. But now we see disruptions that will force potential international investors to reassess the risks in a new way, and that is going to have medium-term impact. I wouldn't say long-term. It all depends on how the conflict ends. So the region is going to be impacted, at least the immediate region. I'll be happy to answer in the Q&A on Israeli economy, but let's just focus on other countries other than Israel. What about Iran, the country that has been the target of these attacks? You have heard on a daily basis, up to 11,000 targets have been hit. Initial targets were military targets, but past 2 weeks, we have seen escalation into industrial and civilian targets. When you destroy the steel industry, when there are attacks on power plants, electronic industry, those are very key for the overall economic functioning of the society, and they have been impacted. And I think it will take many years for Iran to be able to repair those. In terms of immediate supply of basic necessities, such as food, we have not seen a disruption yet because the government usually, on a regular basis, maintains certain amount of reserves of strategic staples, such as wheat or rice. Therefore, the distribution is still such that we don't see a major food crisis in the country. Distribution of gasoline and fuel supply has been rationed because of the number of attacks, but it hasn't been completely disrupted yet. Imports have been disrupted. So the supply of many of these commodities and also inputs for economic activity are eventually going to be affected because of the import disruptions. There is some flow of goods informally and formally with Iraq, with Turkey, which still maintains open borders. But the most important ports for entry for Iran are the ones in Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea, which have been disrupted at the moment. Ships do not dare to approach Iran. Oil exports would be most likely interrupted for several months at least, or even years to come, given the repair requirement. So I think Iran is heading for massive economic crisis if this war continues and moves towards escalation, which I think in the short run, we are likely to witness an escalation, more targets, more economic targets, non-military targets, in order to force the Iranian government into concession. We'll see how that goes. We were warned very strongly to finish in 10 minutes. I am just about 10 seconds left. Thank you.
Thank you. Ali, to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit and look at the longer history of wars on Iran. In Iran's long history, there are various wars. If you read Iran's mythology or ancient history, there are many wars. But if we come also to Iran's modern history, it starts with the Perso-Russian wars in the early 19th century. And then there have been 6 significant wars that have occurred frequently through 19th and 20th century. These have been decisive moments for Iranian history. So Iran and Russia were early 19th century. Iran lost territory, all the Caucasus, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenian, and Armenia, and Turkmenistan. Then wars with Britain, that's when Afghanistan gained independence from the Qajar dynasty. We come forward, we have World War I. Iran was neutral, nonetheless was occupied by the Allied forces. The human toll was very high because it was not just a military occupation, it also brought famine and plague. The Spanish flu to Iran, so many hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of Iranians died. World War II, again, Iran was neutral and again was occupied by the Allies. 1953 was not a coup, but was not a war, but was a coup that was sponsored by United States and Britain, another coercive intervention. And then Iran, 8 years of war with Iraq, and then the last war in June, and then the current war. So any Iranian that has lived through 20th century and 21st century regular life or average life has witnessed or experienced 2 significant wars in their lifetime. And as you see, there have been different dynasties, there have been different political regimes, there have been different reasons for the different invading forces to justify the war, but it has not, the fact has not changed. If we consider just Iraq as a regional war, the rest of them are imperial wars. These are great powers that have violated Iran's sovereignty. The wars have, in many cases, led to the loss of territory. Even under Mohammad Reza Shah, that Iran did not engage in a main war, Bahrain that became independent from Iran. So loss of territory still happened. So when we focus in, when we talk about the nuclear issue or Islamic Republic being a threat, when we zoom out, those justifications don't make a lot of sense. Even in this war, Iran just was in negotiations both this time and in June, and as the Omani prime minister said, Iran agreed not to stockpile enriched uranium, which would basically resolve the nuclear concerns, or even we had the nuclear deal. Or the fact that Iran, it is said that it sponsors terror or is a destabilizing force. Yes, Iran has done destabilizing thing, but Iran is not the only power in the Middle East that has engaged in such activities. The United States has been the biggest source of instability in the region by invading Iraq and in Afghanistan, and all the civil wars that has ensued in Iraq and has spilled over to Syria. Other American allies, such as UAE, which has a hand in the Sudan civil war, or Saudi Arabia that was just bombing Yemen, or Turkey that was supporting the extremist Sunni groups in Syria, and the list goes on and on. When we put this war in the longer context, we see just a series of imperial wars and violations of Iran's sovereignty. Iranians recognized this from early on, and there were different political projects to respond. The first political project was constitutionalism. Iranians thought that to be strong, to fight with a great power such as Russia, they need to build institutions, they need to adopt a constitution, to install a parliament. And they did all those things, but the constitutional revolution was really undermined and collapsed again under external military pressure. The peak of it was World War I. And then another political project came, which was alliances with Western powers under Reza Shah, personalization of power and modernization. But that project also failed to protect Iran's sovereignty. In 1941, Reza Shah, who had come to power again in a coup in 1921 with British influence, was deposed. And the same thing that now the United States wants to do a regime change. Let's not forget, the United States has done regime change before, and what we see in Islamic Republic is the outcome of that regime change. Then we had Mossadegh, so another moment for the constitutional project, the project to revive Iran's sovereignty, which was democratic, which was nationalist. Again, this failed under the 1953 coup. And then a new project took power, sidelined other rivals, and that is the Islamic Republic project, which is Islamist, which is not democratic in that sense. It's populist or popular. It still mobilizes the masses, and it has been authoritarian. And the Iraq War especially was a major context for further development of this project. The way that, so this brings us to the point how these wars have shaped and reshaped the political order in Iran. So when we look at Iran-Iraq war, it started in 1980. At that time, there is still post-revolutionary conflicts between different revolutionary factions. You had Islamists, you had nationalists, you had different factions of Marxists, and they were vying for political power in Iran. The Iranian civil society was also highly mobilized at that point. These different groups would bring their supporters to the streets. Workers were mobilized. Different educated groups were mobilized. But the war presented an opportunity for Islamists to consolidate power. They used the pretext of the war to suppress and repress various segments of the revolutionary coalition. They purged the government. They kicked out the president at that time. Abul Hassan Banistad was not from the Islamist faction. He was impeached and kicked out. Everyone else was persecuted. The workers' movement was suppressed. And basically, there was a transition from a highly factionalized political scene to a more coherent Islamist political elite. The elite, again, fragmented later after the war ended. And the civil society was suppressed. Similarly, we are already observing similar effects. Iran was not in a very open political scene before that. Nonetheless, the repression has even expanded since the complete internet shutdown. There were executions today and executions, I think, 2 days ago. There are activists in prison that are being imprisoned. Then internet was open. Iranians had a public sphere to speak about these things. Now they don't have access to internet, so they cannot even speak with each other. The political elite of Islamic Republic has always become very cohesive under external pressure, whether it's a pressure of war or whether it's a pressure of the sanctions. Islamic Republic has not been a democratic government, but has been factionalized, and it has had serious elite competition. But right now, you don't see any rifts between different segments of the government. This is something that I think US and Israel maybe would have hoped to see, or if they even called for Iranian soldiers to put down their guns or defect. But this has not happened. It's because this is a type of political regime. These revolutionary regimes emerge out of these episodes of mass violent upheavals, create cohesive elite, create robust repressive apparatus. And there is already a literature in political science. Stephen Levitsky and Lucan Way has written a book and a number of articles, and other people. And I want to add to that another source of power for these type of regimes. The other ones are Soviet, or China, or Cuba, Algeria. Another source of them is that these are highly mobilizational regimes. They're not just suppressing their opponents. They do have a social base, and they have organizations and institutions that they mobilize that social base. And we, again, know this from political science literature, that this type of regimes mobilize at higher rates when they are under pressure of external pressures such as sanctions. We have seen this in Iran too. My own research has shown this. But even under wartime pressure, the mobilizational level has been highest. From the first, and on the first day even Khamenei was killed, so he was the head of the state, and he was the architect of a set of institutions that commemorate martyrdom, commemorate Iran-Iraq war. These are very routine political events that happen in Iran. So he was someone that was preaching his supporters of martyrdom, and now he become a martyr for them. This was very influential, crucial for Mojtaba to become Iran's current leader. Of course, he's son of Khamenei. He had influence within Iran's security apparatus, but the fact that he's the son of the leader was a liability. He doesn't have a resume. He haven't done anything. But the way that America killed Khamenei with all of his family and his grandchild and his wife and his children has turned Mojtaba Khamenei now to the son of a martyr, not any type of martyr, a wartime leader that was fallen during a war that just creates a lot of charisma for him. He's a very unpopular figure among Iranians. There have been even in previous protests chants against his succession, but this has already happened. And even others that have been appointed, such as Zulqadr, that was appointed instead of Larijani as a secretary of the Supreme Council of National Security, is a hawkish and hardline figure. So decapitation has not led to the regime change because it had happened before. In early 1980s, many of the leadership of Islamic Republic was assassinated up to the level of the president. Now it has happened to the level of the leader. And the fact that succession has happened under so much pressure, I think, is making this type of regime even stronger because their institutions has been, at least for now, functioning well. And so I don't think even killing more leaders would change the equation. It just fastened the elite rotation. And let's remember, these current commanders of Revolutionary Guards that are being killed now, they are in their 60s. But during the Iran-Iraq war, these guys were in their 20s. So now they are being replaced by others in their 30s and 40s and 20s, and this has already happened. So a new generation of political leaders are coming up, and this is their formative experience, which is an existential threat. The country is under significant pressure that has been. So the prospect for political order is not very bright. And I think even if United States engages in ground invasion, the current level of forces there are not enough for a full ground invasion. It will not be easy. It will be much harder than what happened in Iraq. And you have already probably learned that Iranian military has a mosaic structure because they were anticipating decapitation. So they have decentralized the command. We now see in the way that they're shooting missiles. But I believe they also have plans in case that Tehran falls, how the remaining units would fight. So the results, I think, of an even full invasion would not be an easy regime change, that if there was an even easy regime change. So because I think the total defeat would not materialize soon. So this would just bring higher chances of civil war. And that's, again, something we know from the political science literature. Alexander Downes has a book, The Catastrophic Success. So this type of military campaigns for regime change, even when they're successful, they are catastrophic because they create fragmentation, they damage statehood, and they double the chance of civil war. We already have seen this in Iraq and in Syria and in Libya and in Afghanistan. So the two likely scenarios that whether the regime falls or the regime doesn't fall certainly does not look to lead to a democratic regime. And there was a poll, I think last week, the results were released in Foreign Policy of Middle East experts. And 95% of the experts said that the path. There is no path to democracy from this military, from this war. I end here and look forward to questions.
On that incredibly optimistic note, I will turn it to Dafna.
Sure. Well, I will be brief because I know you have a lot of questions. And because I'm last on the panel, but also it's my future-oriented nature, just to talk a little bit about how this significant military operation and choice of force, use of force by the United States will lead to change in the future. I argue today that there's 4 disorderings or reorderings that will come out of this moment, almost regardless of what the actual outcome is. And the first one has already been discussed a little bit by Caitlin and others, which maybe is interesting in academia, but also interesting to military planners, which is for 20 years, there was a sort of a matrix or an assumption of how escalation ladders would work in a confrontation with Iran, right? An idea that there would be a tit for tat, an escalation ladder. Obviously, there's a deep literature on this with nuclear states or potential nuclear states. And we saw that in 2024 when there was an exchange of rather limited strikes between Israel and Iran. So there was a constraint element to Iranian response and Iranian missile fire in 2024. And even in the Six-Day War, it was limited in the sense that there was a specific focus and goal. What we're seeing now, the reordering that I think should require some rethinking and after action by both the military planners, but also this sort of security studies, intellectual academic basis for that, is this: Iran has decided to go all out. This is going to be the war to end all wars. It has thrown everything it has at it. And obviously the most important is assuming its role as the toll booth in the Strait of Hormuz, because that's really what the ace in the hole is, the ability to decide which boats will enter and exit, and also to possibly in the future impose a tax. So there will be both a choice of which types of ships, commercial and otherwise, and then how much folks will have to pay to get through. And just briefly, my colleague at CSIS, Mona Yakubian, has described this all-out war to end all war as an expansion of what the planners expected on both vertical and horizontal axis. So the reordering in vertical and horizontal terms have already been discussed, but I would just note on horizontal terms, Iran within the first couple of days of the war attacked up to 14 countries, including a missile that was launched towards Turkey, towards a NATO ally, but then was caught back. So that's an incredible number of countries. You can count the other ones by looking at a map. The UAE is the second most targeted country after Israel. There's been 2,100 drone and missile strikes on UAE. The Houthis have now been employed in this all-out war as a proxy, and that takes away some of the Gulf states' ability to redirect oil through the Red Sea. So that's a significant, ability to again impose this ace on the hole, this toll booth phenomena on energy supplies, and on the horizontal, so regionally horizontal. On vertical, we've already discussed the incredible number of strikes inflicting economic, military, civilian damage on Gulf. There's been attacks on desalinization plants, which for the Middle East is very, very significant given the deficit of water. And then there's also been attacks on data centers, which I would note as students of war for the reordering are very vital. The Gulf has tried to diversify by investing in data centers, and there's been 6 strikes on IBM facilities and 3 on Amazon World Services, just as factoids of this war. So the verticality is also extensive, and I believe it requires a reordering of our notions of escalation ladders. The second reordering is in the region. Obviously, the region of the Middle East will not look the same after this war as it did on February 28th. For obvious reasons, but let me just name a few. Israel is trying to use this war to change fundamentally the dynamics of Lebanon, so there's no longer going to be a contestation of the use of force between Hezbollah, mostly based in the south, but also in Beirut, and the Lebanese armed forces and the government. It's trying to eradicate Hezbollah's source of political and military support, including through missile strikes on Beirut. The Gulf Ukrainian defense collaboration has already begun with the Zelensky visit, and the idea that Ukrainians adapt nimble ability to basically engage a much more powerful neighbor is a source of learning for the Gulf states. The unification in the region between what were the most important diplomatic schism on February 28th has now all but been forgotten, which is until February 28th, the Saudis and the UAE were in a bitter split, and they were asking for allegiances as 2 big poles in the region. And they were asking, are you with us or against us in this feud, essentially, between neighbors? That is not being discussed because, again, they're both under attack by the same joint enemy. So that will reunify the GCC in ways that we can begin to imagine, but will certainly play on. Israeli collaboration with the Gulf, which was already ongoing on military intel, economic matters will probably intensify, we'll see, and on and on and on. So that's on the regional reordering, and I think there are many more that we could list, but just giving you an idea. The third reordering is nothing short of geopolitics, which is the title of this talk. And just to give you a sense, I believe, and I think others have said, that this shock is like COVID-19 in the sense that it's elevating and exposing sources of vulnerability to all states around the world. So Filipino workers who can't get to work because there's no gas in the Philippines, they are vulnerable to the price and sources of oil from the Gulf. The US sanctions regime has been proven to be a source of weakness, actually, because it was something that the Trump administration, in terms of the oil and gas sanctions, had to quickly alleviate and relieve. So interestingly enough, in the past 2 weeks, the US government has relieved sanctions on Russia and Iran to an extent even more than the relief that was offered under the JCPOA. So this idea that economic coercion is just one way and is not reverse leverage has to be rethought, and that's a part of the reordering of economic coercion that will have to go on after this. There'll be butterfly effects. We've talked about fertilizer, ag, food security, data centers, and then the authoritarian nexus. I believe this will reify and reaffirm the ordering between authoritarian colleagues and collaborators in Russia, China, and Iran. We're already seeing the sharing of intel and other support from Russia, et cetera. And then that leads us to the fourth reordering. From where I sit in Washington, D.C., where I live, and this is the one that's most tendentious. So if I were a betting woman, I would not want to take a bet on this, because nothing is for sure these days in Washington. But I will assert here that I do believe there will be a reordering in the Washington discussion of the War Powers Resolution, at the very least. And for those who've been following, there's been an uptick in votes on every iteration of the War Powers Resolution that has gone through the Senate and the House. Since February 28th, there have been at least 3 votes. There was also votes taken in January when we were after Maduro, and there have been some version of a War Powers Resolution sent forward for a vote on and off for the past 4 to 5 years, and that's mostly because the very broad war powers authorities offered in the 2002 AUMF, which might sound like ancient history to the students at MIT, but that was essentially the very broad war powers that were offered by Congress to the executive branch after 9/11 and that were used then for the Iraq War. And so the one thing I would offer is to look at 60 days plus on February 28th. Those 60 days is written into the war powers that Congress is forced to vote after 60 days. So the current war powers on the book says that Congress just needs to be informed of military actions before 60 days, but when a military operation exists and endures after 60 days requires congressional approval. Now, interestingly, as a fact, the US has not been really engaged, apart from Iraq and Afghanistan, in additional military operations that it's called, wars, really since then. And even in Libya, in a war that the US was engaged in and then turned over to NATO forces, I say we, because I was in the Obama administration working on this, we did some fancy footwork by saying we don't actually need to go back to Congress after 60 days because it's no longer a US-led operation, it was a NATO-led operation. So I will end with there, but I, again, won't put money on it, but do believe there'll be a reordering of the discussion of war powers in Washington and what authorities require congressional approval.
Thank you for holding your applause. Please join me now. And I'd like to get to your questions. So there's a microphone in the middle. I'll actually ask you, because we'd like everyone to be able to hear, to go to the microphone, queue up there, if it's okay. And you may direct your question to a particular panelist or to all of us in general, and we will.
Thank you very much. This question is, I think, anyone that feels relevant can respond. So do you think, in terms of the war objectives, does Trump see a deeper strategic goal in this war that many people in the media talk about, which is geopolitical competition with China? That by controlling the energy flow, maybe Trump sees a much bigger prize in this war that justifies all the risks and the costs that the US may have to pay for this war. In addition, of course, to Israel's goals of security against Islamic Republic. Maybe the goals of Israel and Trump have now unified. So they have now, there is this unification of the strategic goals at this period of time that, again, Islamic Republic is at the weakest point of its history. It has lost its proxies. Syria lost. Lebanon, Hezbollah lost. Hamas is weakened. So it's the best opportunity for Israel and the US with the unified goals to come and disrupt Islamic Republic at this stage. Thank you.
I'm happy to jump in. Are we doing that? Thanks for your question. I'll just key in on the question of geopolitical competition with China. I've heard this argument as well, that this war will somehow enable the United States to have a stranglehold over China's oil supplies, and I don't really follow the logic very well. We should know, if we end up in the sort of world that Dafna's talking about, where the Strait of Hormuz is a toll booth, it actually could advantage China in the sense that Iran, could ensure that oil gets to China and maybe not to other places like the United States and its allies. And currently, my understanding is that Iran actually, is letting some shipping go through, and that includes oil that has been bound for China. So, if anything, it seems like the war has sort of had the opposite effect. Pardon me?
But that is the short term.
Sure. It's the short term now, but Iran also could make it the long term, right? I mean, that is a plausible outcome of this war, that it is Iran who gets a stranglehold over what goes where. So, that's point number one. Point number two would be that if the United States wants to have a stranglehold over China's oil, and the United States thinks that that is its coercive ace in the hole against China, you don't have to block the Strait of Hormuz to do that. There's like the Strait of Malacca, right? There are other places, and the U.S. Navy, I think, thinks about that problem of potentially blockading China's energy supplies in a war as a coercive tool, which is part of why China is working to develop overland pipelines. So again, is fighting an elective war of choice that has lots of other bad downstream consequences really worth it? The third and final point I would just make is that I think overall for U.S. geopolitical competition with China, this war has been really negative. If you think about the things that are relevant to deterrence of Chinese aggression against Taiwan, the forward presence of U.S. military forces in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region, is really important. Well, where's the Marine Expeditionary Unit that is, being, I think it's actually arrived, the 31st MU, that's coming from Japan. So, we're denuding forces in the Pacific, not to mention the fact that we're blowing through munitions stockpiles of things like Tomahawk missiles that are highly relevant to China-Taiwan scenarios. So, if I'm Xi Jinping, I don't look at this war, I think, even in the long term, as like a masterstroke by the United States. If anything, the opposite.
Can I?
Yes, please.
Okay, so if you look at the behavior of China towards U.S. presence in Persian Gulf, the United States has many military bases. It has heavy military presence already before this war. That was the situation, and China never challenged that. China benefited from the security arrangement that had been established by United States. And throughout the history of past 60 years, U.S. has never threatened to blockade Hormuz against its adversaries. That's not, I think, part of the strategy of United States. So in that sense, I don't think this is significant. One quick addition. China has far more economic and diplomatic relations with Arab countries than Iran. Even if as the result of this conflict, Iran is flipped and Iran's relations with China are damaged, still it doesn't do anything to harm China's relations with other three and other countries. And those happen to be security partners of the United States, but their largest trade partners are, economic partners are China.
I'm going to hold us there and take the next question. Thank you.
Hi. My question is about your understanding of Israel's calculus in trying to escalate today. We understand a month ago, somehow they decided to go into this war, maybe with some miscalculation of strategic objectives that they thought viable, and U.S. somehow continued with that, even though it's very unclear what U.S. as a strategy objective was. But today, it seems that now they know Hormuz is really a chokehold, and destruction of the capacities of production of oil and petrochemicals and so on in the Middle East would be really hugely costly for the world economy. So what does it seem to be the positive for Israel at this point to escalate, understanding, kind of following Ali's point, that it seems very hard to change the regime. There is really no credible path towards a real regime change. So in this situation, but there are lots of reports that Israel seems to be pushing towards escalation, towards destroying Iran's economic infrastructure, which will lead to those escalatory steps. So that's kind of really puzzling for me, and I'm wondering what you folks know about that or think about. Sure.
You want to start?
I can
Start, and I'll
go
go
ahead.
there, yeah.
Surely,
Nader and
surely.
Dafna.
The assessment of Israel in February 28 was that this would be a quick war and it can lead to regime change. And we already have evidence, it has been reported, and they convinced the United States. So that was the motivation for coming in. As far as why they are escalating now, politically it is very difficult, both for Trump and for Netanyahu to back down. They have invested so much in this. Furthermore, Iranian society is heavily polarized. We have, when we look at the reaction to the current war, you have those who have rallied around the government, but you have those who have further distanced themselves, and they blame the government for not avoiding this conflict and not foreseeing what was going to happen with this. That polarization means that I think when you look at the way Israelis select targets, they are still hopeful that this massive bombardment with these strategies can still lead to some kind of regime change or regime paralyzation such that Iran cannot be an effective adversary anymore. That's my opinion.
Thanks, and Dafna.
There's one small explanation, and then I think there's one central explanation. And again, this is my personal view. I don't know, I can't get into the head of any particular leader. One small explanation is the relative ease with which Israel was able to prosecute the war, the 12-day war in June, and the relative success in getting assets, getting inside the regime, getting the sources. I mean, I'm sure, and again, we were then told, the public, that a lot of the nuclear capacity of Iran had been decimated, right? Trump said, mission accomplished, et cetera. So there was an assessment that was so successful. I think that was a small contribution. So I wouldn't put that in more than 5 to 10% as a causal variable. I think the bigger thing, and it's very hard for us to understand but this is something that Bibi Netanyahu has believed for 20 years. He's convinced his top security apparatus and the security leadership, and I think he's actually convinced the public of this, that a nuclear-armed Iran would mean the end of Israel as a state. And so everything had to be done to prevent nuclear Iran, especially with all the proxies and the ballistic missile capacity. And a corollary to that belief, again, that he convinced others of, including his public, was that the diplomatic approach would never work because there wouldn't be enough ability to prevent cheating, and that the international community can never be sufficiently powerful enough to prevent an implementation of a JCPOA. So if you understand that belief system, it sort of explains, and again, I'm not saying I subscribe to that belief, but that is the pure belief that he personally holds, and it explains why he mounted a campaign against the Barack Obama administration against the JCPOA. If you believe that it's fundamentally, existentially threatening to your own country's survival to negotiate on the nuclear question. And then subsequently, when Trump tore it up and then the nuclear activity resumed, that has only added fire. And so if this is your belief system, you believe that only a military conflict can deal with the nuclear problem, and you might as well do it when you believe Iran is strategically at its weakest, i.e. its proxies have been weakened, as a previous questioner described with Hamas and Hezbollah, et cetera. Again, that's the rationale that I believe is a very significant contribution to the beginning of the war. And I think he believes it, and I think many, many others believe it.
While we're on this topic, the top voted question from the internet is to ask each of you about the final goals of US intervention. That could mean many things. We've heard some about goals of different actors, including not just that this is a US intervention, but also an Israeli intervention. Are there other goals that feel top of mind for you that you want our audience to know about?
I can comment on Iranian government's objective in this conflict. Iran has been in this conflict on and off for more than 47 years, ever since the start of the revolution. So the talks and the speeches of the Iranian officials in the months leading to February 28 indicated that they were thinking that this is a war, existential war, that will finally settle this ongoing conflict, because they realized that just postponing it to another conflict, postponing it to another aerial bombardment will not be something that they can cope with indefinitely. So they were prepared to go all the way. They see it existential. So even though they did not initiate it, their behavior clearly indicates that they were anticipating and they were looking at it as the major existential war that will either they will survive and then they would be able to live in peace, maintain their objectives, or they would be destroyed. And either way is better than the status quo from their point of view.
I mean, it's hard to say what the final goal of U.S. is here, because their objective changes every day: regime change, military degradation, taking Iran's oil, as Trump said, changing the name of the strait to the Strait of Trump. So I can't read their minds, and it might be a different goal tomorrow. But what I have observing now is that if the war was about regime change in the beginning, it doesn't look like that anymore. Because now that the targeting of civilian infrastructure has expanded. Residential buildings have been targeted in Iran. Schools have been targeted. My own high school has been bombed. I believe there was no nuclear activity or missile activity going on there. 2 Iranian universities have been bombed. 2 major steel plants that are the backbone of Iranian industry have been bombed. Other factories have been bombed. A dairy factory yesterday I saw was bombed. Again, I don't know what is the missile function or nuclear function of a dairy factory. And this now looks like more not a degradation of Iran's military, but degrading Iran as a nation state, because these are all the infrastructure that a nation state needs to survive. So maybe Israel has realized that regime change is not feasible, so let's just degrade Iran as a nation state so they cannot build for time to come.
Thanks. Next question from the room. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very impressive. And I would like to ask why this war happened. I mean that before this war, their top experts in U.S. warned that the situation and also the talk in Oman went quite well. But like Jack Sullivan, he mentioned that some misunderstanding from the Trump administration. And how do you evaluate the policy decision-making now in the White House and the impact, and of course the impact from Israel to these as a gap of the policy orientation between these two governments? And also the final question is that how do you evaluate the possible scenario about this war? We are not at the worst scenario yet. There's military or nuclear threat. There are also nuclear plant in UAE as well, and also some civilian facilities, many things like this. So can you imagine the possible scenario and the solution for this war? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Any of those three questions?
Sure. I mean, I'll just jump in on this sort of why did this happen point. I mean, I think there was a mix of elements that came together. Dafna's comments got to some on the Israeli side, which I think that was very accurate. Combined, with that worldview, I think the Israelis sort of had a moment of opportunity, tactically speaking, to go after senior leadership, and so I think that did probably kind of push things to a head. On the U.S. side, I mean, as I mentioned in my remarks, I do think there's an element of hubris here. I think that the Trump administration learned some bad lessons from Operation Midnight Hammer last summer and from the raid on Venezuela, and what is being contemplated here in terms of not just regime change, but let's put the regime change element aside and say that was never going to happen. Maybe that was just a hope. But just the military objectives, which, as I tried to point out, are very ambitious here. I mean, rolling back the nuclear program, really ending the conventional ballistic missile threat, really ending the asymmetric naval threat to the Strait of Hormuz. I feel quite confident that the administration, at least by the career intel community and the military, was probably briefed on how difficult those things were, but was sort of in the mode of I'm on a roll. I've overcome the odds in these other operations, and I think there wasn't an appreciation for how different the scale and difficulty of this sort of operation was going to be. So I do think that there's a sequencing element here that's really important in explaining why this was attempted.
I will say to part of your question that it is still unclear who was leading who, and it's a sensitive thing for the Trump administration facing accusations from some of its strongest supporters that it's deferring foreign policy, perhaps, to partners and allies. It's hard to know what to make of that, but I think that discourse will be important. And I think that discourse means that it will be more difficult for the current administration to de-escalate. So as I try to predict what's going to happen, I see de-escalation windows narrowing. And when I think about why wars happen, it's because there are windows for negotiation, and those windows close. And we can talk theoretically, because I like theory, about why those windows close. But when I see a closing window, I think, wow, that's potentially a really long war. And that is one of the factors that I think closes the window, is that there is a rhetorical trap even that renders the administration sensitive to demands of core supporters that it articulate its own foreign policy. I also will add that it's not clear to me that quagmire in Iran is the worst option for the US government. Maybe, obviously, immediate success is a really good option, but degrading Iran's capabilities over a long period of time achieves many US foreign policy goals in the region. Next question. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been very helpful for me. I'm curious, given the way you've been framing this as an existential threat to Iran, and it doesn't appear that they're losing, unclear if they're winning, but they don't appear to be losing. What if the dynamic changes? What are the things they could do to escalate that maybe they've been restrained about so far? And how would the US respond? So as an example, you talked about hitting certain plants that would affect civilians, water plants. It seems like the Iranians, with all of their proxies, could do things like kidnap Americans, which is kind of a soft target. Why has that not happened? Is that the reason? And then from the point of view of Russia and China, they seem to be benefiting so far in the ways you've described. But if Iran is losing, could they do things that would escalate the situation in ways that would make it difficult to avoid a bad outcome?
I have thoughts.
I do too. You go first.
So I think this is a really important question because it demonstrates awareness of the fact that Iran actually has not pulled all of its escalation levers yet, and it hasn't. And I think it has not because the US also has not actually pulled all of its escalation levers. This is still a limited war. There is restraint on both sides. It has ratcheted up from where it began, but it has not ratcheted all the way up. And one of the reasons that I have concerns about some of the US moves toward escalation in the form of ground forces that I do is because I think Iran still has some cards that it can play. You mentioned terrorism. I think that's one of them. I think Iran also has some significant cyber capabilities that we should be thinking about. I mentioned that Iran has not actually yet used its most advanced missiles. I mean, there's limited we don't know every single thing about every missile that they use, but it has appeared that they are still holding in reserve some of their most maneuverable advanced missile capabilities, which again would suggest maybe they're going to go after other targets later on. If the U.S. and Israel continue to expand what they're going after. And the other thing that they've not done is they have not done large-scale mining in the Strait of Hormuz. And that really has the potential to much more permanently and indiscriminately block the strait, and it makes the escort problem significantly harder. And whether that's because they can't, because all their mine warfare capabilities have been eliminated, or just that they've chosen not to so far, we don't know. But it's something that I would think about.
I would just add on the Russia-China part of the question, which is a huge topic, but just a few thoughts on that. China has really good planning on a strategic reserve, so it has around 100 plus days of oil available. So that gets us, some time into the future. I also think China and Russia are different types of friends of Iran, so I think China wants to see very tepidly what the situation is before it would offer really too much material help, although obviously its main interest here is access to the oil that we all know needs to feed its economy. On the China point, we have not mentioned the diversion of US forces from the Pacific to the Middle East, including a major Air Force carrier, which China is only probably just watching and smiling because the major Air Force carrier from the South China Seas that was trying to deter the South China Seas has now been rerouted. So that's just an implicit win. China doesn't have to do anything, right? And its life just got a lot easier. But I don't think China will try to intervene to help save Iran if that's the scenario you're imagining. On the Russian side, I think it's a little bit more interesting. I mean, Russia is clear. The news reports are already talking about air support and ISR intel support that Russia's already offering. And again, the ways in which Zelensky and the Ukrainian drone technologies are going to now support the Gulf, and that looks pretty near term, could create even tighter relationships operationally between Russia and Iran. And then it's just a different situation. I think the question to ask about Russia is how this helps it gain momentum on the battlefield vis-a-vis Ukraine. That's the bigger question. And do the oil benefits that it's, the relief from sanctions that I talked about, the huge high boost in the price of oil, right, how that benefits Russia in its back and forth. And there has been some change in the battlefield dynamics in the past couple of weeks in Ukraine itself that have been, the news has barely covered because of what's happening in the Gulf. So I think the question there is the variable of the price of oil and how that changes the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yeah.
Oh, actually, for the sake of time, the queue in the room, and I cannot express the length of the queue online, we'll take the next question, and I will have, I think, one panelist respond to each question going forward. Try to keep them short so we can get it through as many.
Yeah, hi. My name is Deja Weiner. Thank you guys for hosting this. It's been a wonderful event and learned a lot. I had a question, kind of a two-part question, and I'll just try to make it short. One is we're watching the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Navy have this sort of standoff, precision strikes from dispersed bases, and Iran is still able to strike those bases and slow down to some capacity to push out the aircraft carriers. And I'm wondering, what is China learning about sort of being able to push aircraft and naval assets away from the Chinese mainland vis-a-vis Taiwan? And then the second question is rather specific to the Strait of Hormuz. I just wanted to know a little bit more of your thoughts on how the U.S. military is going to or may develop its escort options in terms of clearing out some of the unmanned surface vehicle mining capabilities and cruise missiles, as mentioned. So yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, I won't always answer, but can I?
This one.
Do you want to take this one?
Just talk about those.
Go for it.
I honestly think U.S. does not have the option to open the Strait of Hormuz, very simply. The escorting needs equipment, needs ships, it's costly, and it cannot bring the flow to the capacity when it was just open and everyone was going through. And it is not, you know that it is not literally closed, it's the threat. And Iran even does not need the shores near the strait to shoot drones or missiles. There's a vast land of Iran, and they can, from the center of Iran, from mountains, from everywhere, they can shoot drones. And even in the coast, there are these high-speed boats that they can use, and it's not all visible. So just the fact is about geography here, which makes it almost, I think, impossible to open it under like war condition to the level that it was open. It would need a full ground invasion, which I spoke earlier, how it's costly, it's difficult, it will take time, and I think it's very hard to bring to total to the defeat of Iranian forces.
Immediately violating my rule because I want to hear from Caitlin too.
I think you make good points. I'll just comment on the what has China learned. I mean, I think your question, you sort of answered your own question with the question, right? Which is to say that I think China has learned that the United States has not taken base hardening and base dispersal seriously. And that's evidenced by the fact, as you said, that there have been successful attacks on US forces within missile and drone range of Iran. And the United States Air Force has developed this concept called agile combat employment in the Pacific, saying, oh, we're gonna disperse in conflict and we're gonna move around, and that's why we haven't built hardened aircraft shelters. And all I can say is if you like Al Udeid or you like Prince Sultan Air Base, you're going to love Andersen Air Force Base right on Guam. Go look at what's vulnerable there. So I think there are real questions here, and this gets to some of the point Dafna made about reordering and learning after this. Is the concept that the U.S. has had about operating from forward bases that are relatively vulnerable going to be viable in other theaters?
Rich, I want to commend you and CAS for pulling this wonderful panel together. It's great to hear this conversation. The question starts micro and then goes macro. We've got the map of Hormuz up there. Just thinking about ways out of this, and I share your concern that it may be a stalemate quagmire. I don't think it's not clear why Israel and America launched the war. It's unclear how it plays out. So my micro question is, there's a lot of talk about islands, and we could just about see Tumb and Abu Masa islands on the map. How upset will Iran be if those contested islands are occupied by people? Just be interested. Karg may be a distraction. Through to the macro, we've talked about China and Russia and Team Red. What should Arab and European allies make of the US as a geopolitical actor, given its behavior in this particular conflict?
That was two questions. I can take the second.
We'll take the second question first while we contemplate the map.
So on the reordering, I mentioned a few levels of reordering. The reordering geopolitically, I think, very much includes the Europeans, and we don't need to go back 2 weeks to recount the story of Trump asking or bullying the Europeans to come help open the straits, and the Europeans reacting kind of with astonishment. I think the bigger issue is, do questions of collective security among the transatlantic relationship change after this? So you can chart the story starting essentially in 2003 when George Bush went to the UN, went to his NATO allies, and tried to at least rally for a war that didn't have much international legal justification, but he at least tried, and I can't believe I'm relishing this moment, in February 2023, where he tried to get multilateral support, particularly with the transatlantic allies and with NATO support. And the invasion and the changing justifications for the objective in 2003 really weakened the basis of the US acting for collective security. And again, I think that was the beginning of a maybe end chapter for how this collective security arrangement will work. And then you have this month where there was a request to kind of join, and really no even explanation for what the goals were, what the justifications were, why the Europeans would find this in their interest, except for an obvious global economic interest. So I didn't think that reordering is top of the geopolitical reordering. On the Gulf, I've talked a little bit about the reunification of bitter enemies, February 28th enemies, and the ways the different Gulf countries were feuding, essentially. And they were feuding around a couple issues, including ideology, including economics, including normalization with Israel. So I do think that's going to change significantly. And I also think this might be a prompt for greater GCC security reintegration. For 20 to 30 years, the US government has been trying to get the GCC to have more of like a ASEAN or type arrangement on security and considering Gulf security as one. And despite best efforts, there's been some movement and progress, but really not as much as you could imagine could be. And there's so many internal differences in all of these countries, but I can imagine a reordering after this that allows for greater interoperability and alliance formation in GCC.
I'm going to hold and keep taking questions, and we'll see where we get. Please.
So you're not going to answer the first question of the previous person? Okay, so hi, thank you for organizing this event. I guess I also have two questions. I'll ask a more important one first. And I'll ask the first one only. So this came up a couple times that people mentioned both on the panel and the questions of the situation of quagmire. I was wondering if like in the talking about the goals of the war, it was from the beginning, inherent goal to just destabilize the nation of Iran, both from Netanyahu and Trump, to really take advantage of that. I don't see any disadvantage to the US by causing a civil war or an internal disruption of like polar groups within Iran. That would both decentralize the power within the Middle East, which would allow Israel to do whatever it wants, and also with the United States, it would allow them to kind of take advantage of whatever is going on within Iran, and also that destabilization of Iran would probably allow more terrorist groups to come up, which would allow generally less secure Middle East, which would allow the US to also sell more guns. So I was wondering, what's your thought on that?
Who would you like to answer?
Huh?
Who would you like us to answer?
We'll go with Ali. Thank you.
So the goal of destabilizing Iran, I think Israel would like that. And one of their officials said, they said, if a coup happens, we take it. If there's a revolution, if there is a civil war, so any sort of damage, I think they consider it a strategic advantage. I don't think that is the case for the United States, because a civil war would lead to immigrations, asylum takers. They would be going to Turkey. They would be going to the other countries around the region that are American allies. And this would just destabilize the whole region. I mean, the spillover of Syrian civil war was not something that Turkey, for example, enjoyed, or any of the other countries. It creates social issues, political issues for those countries. So I don't think that is American interest. On top of that, I think the situation of civil war right now, you know that it's the Revolutionary Guards that is shooting the drones. But then we are talking about a hypothetical situation that there are offshoots of Revolutionary Guards here and there, and they can just shoot drones at the Strait of Hormuz or elsewhere. So that would not end the disruption of global economy and issues that the United States would be interested in.
Thanks for understanding our brevity.
Hi. In the spirit of holding politicians accountable for the reasons they say they do things, what do y'all think would have been the implications if Iran got a nuclear weapon?
Would you like me to?
Please, yeah.
If Iran had nuclear weapons, I think US and Israel would have been more cautious. And that's why something that has not been brought up is the current status of the stockpile of enriched uranium in Iran, which was bombed in June. Right now, I think, just thinking rationally, the Iranian regime is probably trying to enrich that to the point of at least making a number of dirty bombs for sake of their own survival, and trying to use that as a bargaining chip. But precisely because a nuclear Iran would deter attack. And then it will change the balance in the Arab-Israeli conflict in such a way that would be completely disadvantage to Israel, that Israel is so adamant in trying to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power, and also the United States.
And given time, this will be the final question. I apologize to everyone on our internet chat. We'll try to move quickly. Thanks.
Hi. Well, thank you. I'm glad to be closing. I have a two-part question as well. The first being, can you talk about your confidence in Pete Hegseth's ability to actually orchestrate and lead this effort? And then in terms of homeland security, what should we or US leadership be thinking about as a result of the consequences of this? So what might happen here? And if you were advising, say, the next administration, what should they start thinking about from now?
I'll actually start, if I may. Some of my research touches on this. Working from public statements, my understanding is that Secretary of War Hegseth has a very different theory of victory in war than some previous secretaries of defense have had. And he's stated that the US military has been too restrained, has not been able to use its full might to achieve military outcomes. I think this gets to Dr. Talmadge's point that no aerial bombardment campaign has ever led to a democratic transition. But you could take that another way, which is to say we didn't try hard enough. And so my understanding is that that's where the secretary is coming from. It is a very tragic empirical question, and I think it is not working. But that's my understanding of the theory there. And I will say, to the secretary's credit, it is a coherent theory. It just may be wrong in my estimation. Dafna, I saw you move in a way that made me think.
Well, on the DHS and Homeland Security, I think this is a huge area where I wish there was more discussion in the press on this. We've talked a little about Iran's ability to project various operational and other levers internal to the homeland. And we know that Iran has tried to kill the President of the United States and his advisors from after the in 2020 or after the last killing of a leader in Iraq. But anyway, there's a part of DHS that's very important that doesn't get a lot of press called CISA. And it handles the attacks on critical infrastructure, internal and domestic to the United States. It fits in a very wonky way in the Department of Homeland Security, which we know from other issues was a massive agency that was created after 9/11 by combining odds and ends and has all kinds of dysfunctions as a result. But this was a very important agency because it was able to translate from the federal government national security threats that could be gleaned from abroad to cities and states and governors about what types of critical infrastructure needed to be protected, from plants to cyber operations to healthcare facilities to supply chains, et cetera. And both sides of Congress, bipartisan, have supported CISA for the past 10 or so years. I'm very, very worried that in this administration, among the other DOGE and other reductions in force of the US government, CISA has been cut by 2/3, I believe, in part because one of its functions was election security. Again, that wasn't its primary job, but election security, the actual infrastructure of election, was part of its general infrastructure job and responsibility. But because it was in charge of so much else, and it really did embody the spirit of DHS's creation, which is to make sure there weren't silos and breakdowns in communication between FBI, CIA, DOJ, and state and local police, and was doing a good job at that. I'm very worried about it. And if there would be one thing, if I were to mobilize Congress on, in addition to questions of war power, where is our domestic homeland security, CISA, and similar type mechanisms to defend our critical defenses?
Thank you all for joining me for Geopolitics of the Strait of Hormuz. I appreciate the lively questions and most of all the expertise of our panelists. Thank you so much for being here. Join me in thanking them.